Azerbaijan, a country of just over 9 million people, lies at a strategic crossroad between Europe and Asia. With the Islamic Republic of Iran to its south and Russia to its north, Azerbaijan forms part of an east-west corridor that is vital to American security. Central Asia and the Caspian Sea transit the east-west corridor, affording energy security to America's European allies. Most important, with all of the uncertainty that surrounds developments in Iran and Syria, Azerbaijan is a stable country in an unstable region. Azerbaijan is the world's oldest secular Muslim country. It looks back on a proud history of liberal reforms and the establishment of the Muslim world's first democracy in 1919. Regrettably, that democracy was crushed by an invasion that subjected Azerbaijan to Soviet rule for 70 years. Today, Azerbaijan's natural resources and geographic position inspire hope of a bright future. The country already boasts impressive economic growth. Still, it is also beset with many of the developmental and political challenges that plague post-Soviet countries. Our objective is not to varnish over Azerbaijan's shortcomings. There are many challenges that dedicated people, Azerbaijanis and others with shared interests, are struggling to overcome. Our intent is to highlight the strategic importance of Azerbaijan to the United States and its allies, and to point out that its stability could be undermined by Iran, Russia, or the Armenian occupation of a large part of Azerbaijani territory. The point is neither to praise nor to criticize Azerbaijan, but to help it find a viable path to a better future.
Azerbaijan lives in a rough neighborhood. It has two highly imperially minded neighbors, Russia and Iran, both of whom have been aggressive vis-a-vis their neighbors for centuries, indeed in one case millennia.
What you have, of course, is in the Caucasus. Take a look at a map. You've got this narrow little strip of land. It's an isthmus, basically, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. You can see it two ways. Is it a portage between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea? That's the Western interest, is east and west. Or is it a bridge between Russia and Iran, north and south? That's the Russian interest. And that's bound to clash. And that's what we've seen. That's what the attack on Georgia in 2008 was, and that's what the politics to this day pretty much hinge around. What they want to do is they want to control the energy in the Eurasian landmass. And that means controlling the markets. And that means largely that what they're trying to do in the Far East has something to do with what they're doing in the West. They want to be able, they don't want to be at the mercy of the Europeans. Now, for years, the Europeans thought they were at the mercy of the Russians. But the reality is, the Europeans were the only customer that the Russians had. Now, opening up the pipelines to the Pacific, opening up pipelines to China, they're basically giving themselves a safety valve so that they can move oil and gas at will. And I think what they want to do is basically control Europe's supply, or at least a large enough amount, a large enough percentage of Europe's supply that they can be a major geopolitical player, literally at the turn of a spigot, if that's what they choose to do. In their heart of hearts, despite what they may say standing on the red carpet when they arrive at the airport in Baku, they would like all of the countries, not only Azerbaijan, they would like all of the countries of the former Soviet Union to behave like vassal states to the Russian court. I think that's fairly clear what they want. They punished Georgia because Georgia became very recalcitrant and not only refused to act as a vassal state, kind of stood up and made an issue out of it. But what they'd like to see is essentially a suzerainty arrangement where they control what Azerbaijan sells, to whom, how things go. I don't think they want to squash the East-West corridor. They want to control it. Remember remember that war in 2008, yeah, of course it was an attack on Georgia. The war was fought in Georgia. But that was an attack on Azerbaijan. That was an attack on Central Asia. That was an attack on the West, including the United States. That's that East-West corridor I was talking to. That was Russia's, I would guess, last-ditch attempt to say, we control this thing. We can turn this thing off anytime. Remember, look at the geography going from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. If you control Georgia, you control Azerbaijan. That's a system of systems that works. That east-west corridor from Batumi and Poti, the Georgian ports in the west on the Black Sea, to Baku in Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea in the east. That's a system of systems. It has to operate together. Russia does not want an independent Georgia. It does not want an independent Azerbaijan. It does not want an independent east-west corridor. Here is a reality. Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 provinces that are Azeri territory are occupied by the Armenian military. Now that is a reality. You know, for all of the back and forth that you get at the United Nations, there hasn't been much back and forth about that. The United Nations has been very clear that that's the case. And yet you have this Minsk group that's supposed to be facilitating a diplomatic solution, and you have the fox among the chickens. Who's one of the members of the Minsk group? It's the Russians, who have an interest in keeping this thing going there. They don't want this settled. Why? Because if you settled this thing, however you settle it, I'm leaving that, you know, just leave it open as to how, but if it ever were settled, it means that Azerbaijan can get on with economic development, political development, and become a normal country.
I see no indication or reason why Russia should want a settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh matter. I think they are quite pleased to be able to have a major source of tension in that part of the world to serve as something that they can manipulate and meddle in. It offers them another opportunity to try to help dominate and essentially order around countries on its southern flank. Many international discussions are for form purposes only and are not really making any progress toward solving problems. I think the Minsk group is a good example of that kind of diplomatic wheel spinning. Iran, working with Armenia on the one hand and certainly very much with Russia, is ignoring its religious beliefs and the rest in order to try to dominate politically. And sometimes these efforts to dominate manifest themselves, as did the '08 war in Georgia, in physical and kinetic interference. Sometimes they're ideological, but they are a continuing source of difficulty for Azerbaijan.
We have to remember that this is a revolutionary ideological regime. And it sees things through those lenses, which it regards as realistic. We can look at it from the outside and say that's a little crazy, but the reality is they do see things that way. Their first problem with Azerbaijan is a very secular country. It is a country that, of course, is Muslim, but run very much along secular lines. If you walk down the street in Baku, you have very little sense that you're not in the West. It looks like a street in Paris or anywhere else. Everyone once in a while you run across a mosque, you get a couple of indications. And I think that plays a lot bigger role than people think, that enmity there. Then the Iranians have kind of this obsession that the Azeris are doing something to Iran's national security, perhaps in collusion with Israel. Tehran's view of Azerbaijan, yes, nominally a fellow Muslim nation, is that they would prefer to have it weak. I'm afraid religion is trumped by the notion of how do you make it weak? By allying yourself with Armenia. And then you've got to look at the Russian factor. Armenia has traditionally been an ally of Russia. That's not something new since the fall of the Soviet Union. That has always been the case. And we get back to what I was talking about, the East-West versus North-South. Carousel kind of going around where the Armenians don't want to leave Karabakh. The Azeris can't give up and shouldn't give up on giving up their national territory, by the way. The Azerian-Georgian interest and the Western interest runs east and west. The nexus of Iran, Armenia, Russia's interest runs north and south. And so you constantly get this conflict.
Iran would love to have, I think, a very dominating role in this part of the world. They're seeking it more, really, I think, by their nuclear program, after which, if it is successful, they expect everybody to do, in many circumstances, what they want. 2 centuries, Russia had troops of one kind, way or another, in Azerbaijan, from the Napoleonic era, 1812 until last year, I guess, when President Aliyev got them out. Rather substantial and positive undertaking. Took 2 centuries to get it done, but it got done. We will see more stress, more troop deployments, more attempts to dominate pipelines by Russia, more efforts to avoid the West and everybody else having the flexibility and the affordability of natural gas for a whole host.
This is a major geopolitical issue. Does that railroad come down from Sochi, which is just above the border there, if you see on the coast of the Black Sea, come down from Sochi in Russia, through occupied Abkhazia, and in to some fairly unstable areas of Georgia and down to Yerevan. That connects Russia with its traditional ally, Armenia. I mean, I'm sorry, but we got to start putting names on things here. Armenia has been traditionally an ally of Russia back in Tsarist times, during Soviet times, and now. Derailing the new railroad is a major geopolitical interest. Has the United States spoken up? You know, sometimes by our silence, we also make a policy.
The proposed pipeline that Russia wanted Azerbaijan to use would have run right through Chechnya. The worsening of the relationship between Russia and Georgia was directly connected to the fact that Georgia allowed and facilitated the transport of Caspian Sea oil through pipelines that did not traverse Russian territory.
I saw the pictures from his news conference the other day with President Aliyev, and he looked very, very unhappy. But then again, Mr. Putin looks very unhappy at a lot of press conferences, so it's hard to tell. My guess is he's somewhat unhappy with President Aliyev. I think Moscow does not like an independent Azerbaijan. I don't think they want to squash wash the east-west corridor. They want to control it. They certainly don't want it controlled by BP from the energy financial standpoint. They don't want it controlled by the Americans and the EU from a geopolitical point of view. They'd like to be the ones with their hands on this thing. And the Azeris play a balancing game. And my guess is that what Moscow would really like is to watch that Azeri balancing game stop being sort of like this and kind of become lopsided in Russia's favor, more like some of the Central Asian countries. This goes back not only to President Aliyev, but I think we have to go back to Ilham Aliyev's father, Haidar, at this point. I mean, Haidar Aliyev is the guy who said this is the deal of the century when they signed the agreement for the big pipeline to go from Baku down to Ceyhan on Turkey's Mediterranean coast, the BTC pipeline. It was Haidar who called it the deal of the century. It was Haidar who said Russia cannot dictate this. It was Haidar that struck out essentially for a measure of independence for Azerbaijan. And independence is a hollow thing if you don't have the economics to back it up. And Haidar sort of put them together. Now, Ilham sort of took that over. It was already a going concern. By the time you get 2003, 2004, the pipeline was almost finished. But he's kind of continued that policy. And not only continued it, he's kind of expanded upon that policy.
It's important to realize that Russia may speak with more than one mouth in these matters and may simultaneously fund what they might call dissidents from some countries, Azerbaijan and others, whereas in fact they're trying, let's say, to buy an election. I think you can rarely go wrong being skeptical of the intents and purposes of these days of Russian claims and Russian money.
The United States lives in a neighborhood, and our neighborhood tends to be very centric from an American viewpoint, with allies to our north and south and two big bodies of water to our east and west. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, lives in a neighborhood that's a little bit more interesting. All the nations in that part of the world, and that's been hit on. They live in this neighborhood, and as a sheikh once told me, he said, "General Reist, you're going to go home after this. I have to stay. Your actions can take one form. Our actions have to take another."
And we also have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people in the region. You know, it's real easy to sit in a seminar, you know, in Princeton, New Jersey, and talk about how we just need to have better relations with Moscow and we could do this and this and this. Go sit in Baku, go sit in Tbilisi and see how easy it is to do that. Remember, countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia, they have, by the way, their own nationalist democratic theorists who've written and talked about it. I mean, they have a past they can look to. This is a hard job for both sides, okay? Nobody's ever been down this train track before. All you need to do is live through 70 years of communism with a little but not much experience prior to that in self-governance, and jump up like a phoenix and create a democracy in 20 years and everything will be fine. There's some sincerity on their part of wanting to build a democracy in their country, move things along. I think the question is, how fast can you push the train down what is essentially a broken track? And that's a judgment call, because you could say, well, don't push it too hard, and some of the democratic activists would come back at you and they'd say, well, if you don't push, you're never going to get there. If you just leave the status quo, the status quo will always say, if you push me too hard, it's going to be a disaster. And so you got to push a little bit, and they're not wrong. The status quo will always say, well, you can't push me or, it's going to be the end. So how much of a push And that's a hard call to make when you're sitting in Washington, you're sitting in Brussels, or frankly, if you're a Western democratic worker in Baku, you're a little closer to it. But even there, it's hard to know how much this can take. The local people have to be the prime mover in their own democratization, in their own reforms, in their own development. You can't, as we have frankly found out, I think, with some efforts that the United States has been running over the past decade, you can't just show up in a country and reverse the course of history, with a few good arguments that are taken from our forefathers, from our experience.
The United States, however, needs to make sure that it continues to work with Azerbaijan and Georgia and the other states of the region as much as possible. Russia's effort to dominate the Eurasian continent, particularly by using natural gas, is something that will affect countries all over the globe, and it's something that I think the United States and Azerbaijan have a very similar interest.
And therefore, it is important for the United States to maintain decent relations with a country like Azerbaijan, which is so strategically important given its proximity to Iran and to the Caspian Sea oil supplies, and to counter the attempts of Russia to put pressure on Azerbaijan.
In Phase 1, the assembled crowd of experts identified 14 separate national interests for the United States. The three high-value interests were infiltrating and disrupting Iranian regime activities, particularly those surrounding its nuclear program; counterterrorism operations designed to weaken transnational networks and prevent their concentration, sanctuary seeking in the region; maintaining alternative transit route into out of Afghanistan, avoiding both Russia and Pakistan. The 8 medium value interests were maintaining military access to the wider region and rising ally Azerbaijan in particular, balancing Russian influence in the Transcaucasus, improving relations with Russia, preserving stability in Azerbaijan, increasing Azerbaijan's energy production and export capacity, avoiding a new regional war, neutralizing Iranian mischief, meddling in the region, promoting democracy in the region. Next, we turn to the 7 destabilization scenarios picked by the analysts as being most plausible. In the scenario entitled Azerbaijani Spring, a revolutionary wave arrives amidst falling global energy prices. In the second scenario entitled Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, Baku's diversionary war leads to a Russian military intervention. In the third scenario, entitled Iran Strikes Azerbaijan, Tehran inflicts military punishment on Baku after the US and Israel attack its nuclear program. In the fourth scenario, entitled Chinese Money Destabilizes, Beijing's investments in Azerbaijan spur regional competition and internal conflict. In the fifth scenario, entitled Russia's Immigration Card, Moscow threatens Azerbaijan's flow of remittances from Azeri expatriates and guest workers living in Russia in an attempt to force Baku into closer ties. In the sixth scenario, entitled Caspian Claims, Russia backs Iran's maritime claims to expand its own naval dominance over that sea. In the final scenario, entitled Elections Time, Iran stirs up Azerbaijan's domestic conflicts to influence the presidential vote. Russian and Iranian meddling in Azerbaijani politics is more likely to come through quasi-legal channels, such as funding opposition candidates, than outright attempts to topple the government.
Yes, there's clearly a grain of reality to these scenarios. There's nothing hard to believe here. My guess is it's also partially all of the above. What seems to be missing here is a fairly favorable positive glide path. There seems to be this assumption that, Baku is what it is, and then forces will act on it, and it will have to react, and, these don't seem to end well. And it just seems to me that the possibility for change in a country that is well-resourced, has very good, talented people, the possibility that you will have gradual political change that will enable the country to adapt to situations and not have to react in a sort of 180-degree nasty reaction to the pressures on it. I think I would add an eighth scenario, it seems to me, and it seems to be the one that we would want to encourage. And at the risk of being somewhat, controversial, I think we need to be careful that, I don't want to say that everything is wonderful with the Azerbaijani government. That said, this is a fairly liberal, moderate country where you can do business. I mean, this is not some, it's sort of being painted as sort of, it's going to have to go down the tubes. It's not. If you go to Baku, it's, you don't get that feeling. Washington plays a positive role, recognizing its interests, not to tell our Azerbaijani friends what to do, but to try and encourage this in a way where we have mutual interests, we can work together, and there's a good outcome here for everybody.
And with any luck, we'll fulfill Churchill's line that the Americans always do the right thing, but unfortunately only after they've exhausted all other possibilities.
There's clearly, if you go back to what I said about the South Caucasus East-West corridor, where you've got a system of systems that is roads, it's rails, it's pipelines, both for gas and for oil. It's air corridors. It's a fiber optic corridor that Azerbaijan has just proposed. It's everything that goes between these two countries from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. If you can get to Baku, you then go on ferries to Aktau in Kazakhstan, to Turkmenbashi in Turkmenistan, and you've got access to Central Asia and beyond, on into China. If you go the other way, from the Georgian ports of Batumi and Poti, you can go up the Danube through the canal and end up in Amsterdam. So you're accessing all of Western Europe up to the North Sea. You go through the Mediterranean, you're out in the entire North Atlantic system. We want to be the center of excellence for extending the trunk lines out into Central Asia. We want to make that part of the world connected. There's some political science theories that the world is dividing itself into the connected world and the unconnected world. We want to connect. We want to be the linchpin of the fiber optic trunk line that connects that part of the world. Americans could be involved in that. Any kind of transportation and, all the kinds of equipment that go with ports, with grain elevators, with ferries, with tankers, so all of that, just the building of the corridor is something Americans could be more involved in. And then you got to start thinking, once you have a corridor, stuff goes back and forth, and it's not just oil and gas. You've got every kind of raw material, you've got agricultural products coming one way, you've got manufactured products going the other way. When you get that, you start getting dealerships, you start getting insurance, you start getting all those things. Americans ought to be there. If it's our interest to have a functioning east-west corridor, we ought to make it function. There's the American interest.
Russia is dangling its support for Syria in front of Iran. Iran is in terrible economic shape because of the sanctions, and they know that they really need Russia's help, and Russia's playing it for all it's worth. It would probably support Syria anyway, but it certainly helps to have something else to tell Iran that one is doing. Russia would like for Iran, and fosters Iran's being tough on and not working with Azerbaijan, and the same would be true of other countries in that part of the world. Russia has Iran right now in a very useful spot. It's important for Azerbaijan and the United States and other countries in the region to continue to work together. A strong, democratic, and prosperous Azerbaijan is very much in the interests of the United States. It can be and should be a linchpin, along with some of the other small Caucasus states, of democracy and the rule of law and prosperous economies spreading in that part of the world. It also, in league with the United States, could help limit Russia's and Iran's ability and propensity to push their neighbors around, and pretty much anybody else that they can get into a position to push. I think that we have a lot that we could do together.